There's a reason most people have never heard the full story of orgone energy, and it's probably not the reason they assume. When people come across the term for the first time, it's often dismissed as either outdated science or an unusual historical curiosity. Others encounter passionate claims that seem impossible to verify. Between those two extremes, something important gets lost: the actual history, the context, and the questions that made the idea so controversial in the first place. For decades, conversations about orgone energy have tended to split into opposing camps. One side rejects it without much discussion. The other sometimes presents it as the answer to almost everything. Neither approach leaves much room for careful examination. If you've ever tried to understand where the concept came from, you've probably noticed how difficult it is to separate documented history from interpretation. You read one source that calls it a scientific investigation. Another describes it as pseudoscience. A third focuses almost entirely on legal battles rather than the original ideas. The more you look, the more fragmented the story becomes. That creates a strange kind of frustration. You start with a simple question: what exactly was orgone energy supposed to be? Instead of finding a clear answer, you find conflicting opinions, emotional debates, and decades of disagreement. Each explanation seems to leave out part of the picture. One article focuses on experiments, another focuses on criticism, another focuses on the personality of the man behind the theory. Eventually, many people stop asking, not because the question has been answered, but because the conversation itself becomes difficult to navigate. To understand why, it helps to step back, not to decide whether orgone energy exists, but to understand how the idea developed. The story begins with Austrian physician Wilhelm Reich during the early 20th century. Reich originally worked in psychology and was influenced by the emerging field of psychoanalysis. Over time, however, his interests expanded beyond the mind alone. He became increasingly interested in the relationship between emotional health, physical processes, and biological energy. That shift changed the direction of his work. Reich proposed that living organisms might contain a universal life energy that influenced biological function. He eventually called this energy orgone. From his perspective, this wasn't simply a metaphor for emotion or motivation. He believed it represented an observable natural phenomenon that interacted with living systems. This is where the historical discussion becomes more complicated. At the time, science was already developing increasingly specialized methods for studying biology, chemistry, and physics. Reich's proposals crossed multiple disciplines at once. His observations did not fit comfortably into existing scientific frameworks, and many researchers questioned both his methods and his conclusions. It's a bit like trying to describe weather using only the vocabulary of ocean currents. You may observe real patterns, but your language and tools may not match the phenomenon you're attempting to describe. Whether that comparison is appropriate remains part of the ongoing debate. As Reich continued his work, he designed devices intended to concentrate what he believed was orgone energy. These became known as orgone accumulators, simple structures made from alternating layers of organic and metallic materials. Supporters claimed users experienced increased well-being or relaxation. Critics argued there was no reliable scientific evidence demonstrating that the devices produced any unique physical effect beyond ordinary environmental factors. Over time, the discussion shifted away from the original question. Instead of asking, what observations led to this theory, many conversations became focused on whether Reich himself should be considered credible. That distinction matters. Scientific history often involves ideas that are later revised, rejected, or partially validated. Sometimes the process itself teaches us as much as the outcome. The real issue isn't whether every historical claim surrounding orgone energy was correct. It's whether we understand how scientific ideas are formed, challenged, tested, and remembered. That perspective changes the conversation. Rather than treating the subject as something to either believe completely or dismiss immediately, it becomes possible to examine it as part of the broader history of scientific exploration. History contains many examples of theories that evolved dramatically over time. Some disappeared after better evidence emerged. Others began with incomplete observations before becoming accepted in modified forms. Still others remained interesting hypotheses that never gained sufficient experimental support. Orgone energy occupies a unique place because it sits at the intersection of science, medicine, psychology, philosophy, and public controversy. That combination makes it difficult to discuss objectively. It's easy to confuse criticism of experimental methods with criticism of curiosity itself. Those are different things. Curiosity asks questions. Science attempts to answer them using reliable methods. Those methods include replication, measurement, peer review, and the willingness to change conclusions when stronger evidence appears. Understanding that distinction reduces unnecessary conflict. You don't have to accept every claim to appreciate why someone investigated it. Likewise, rejecting unsupported conclusions doesn't require dismissing the historical circumstances that produced them. The history surrounding orgone energy also reflects something larger about human nature. People naturally search for patterns that explain health, vitality, and well-being. When existing explanations feel incomplete, new ideas often emerge to fill those gaps. Sometimes those ideas contribute valuable observations. Sometimes they overreach beyond available evidence. Often, reality turns out to be more complex than either supporters or critics initially expected. Looking back with historical distance allows us to recognize that complexity without forcing simple conclusions. For anyone interested in the topic today, the most useful approach is probably neither immediate belief nor immediate rejection. Instead, begin by separating documented historical events from later interpretations. Read original sources alongside modern scientific evaluations. Notice where evidence is strong, where it becomes uncertain, and where assumptions begin replacing observations. That process doesn't guarantee a final answer. It does create a stronger foundation for understanding why discussions about orgone energy continue decades after the original research first appeared. History is often less about finding perfect certainty and more about learning how ideas evolve over time. And sometimes understanding the path of an idea is just as valuable as understanding the idea itself. If you'd like to explore the historical evidence in more detail, there's a structured breakdown linked in the description. Subscribe if you're interested in examining complex topics through careful historical context. Thanks for watching.